Picture this. It's 1925. You walk into a brightly lit, bustling department store. Maybe it's a huge Sears Roebuck right in the heart of a city like Chicago that's just exploding with modernity.
And the air is electric.
Mm.
I mean, literally.
Mm.
Because this place is selling things you've only just heard about, maybe seen in a magazine.
Exactly. And your eye catches this. This truly revolutionary machine. Something designed to completely change the drudgery of your daily life. A modern electric washing machine.
And that machine, in 1925, is priced at $150. Now, we really need to ground that figure for you.
Yeah, that sounds like nothing to us today.
Right, but for the average factory worker back then, $150 was an enormous sum. It was almost 3 months of their hard-earned salary.
3 months' pay. Wow.
Yeah. So for generations, that appliance would have been an impossible luxury, just completely out of reach unless you saved up every single penny for, what, 5 or 6 years?
Yeah. But saving is what your grandparents did. You, the modern consumer of the Roaring Twenties, you don't have to wait. Because here comes the smartly dressed salesman.
And he smiles, leans in, and he offers you 4 words that didn't just sell washing machines. They fundamentally rebuilt the entire American economy.
He said $1 down, $1 a week.
And that shift is immediate. It's psychological. Suddenly that impossible $150 price tag, it just vanishes.
Right. It's not a real number anymore.
It's not. The object you desire is now attainable for a single dollar, the cost of a cheap lunch. You get the utility, you get the status, and you get the convenience today.
And the problem of the actual payment.
It gets magically punted into the future.
Yeah.
It becomes this small, manageable weekly thing you barely notice. It's the birth of the immediate gratification economy.
That moment, that profound cultural and financial pivot from saving before you buy to spending now and paying later, that is the core paradox we are diving into today.
We're unpacking the source material on the Roaring Twenties, which is the decade from 1920 to 1929. Internationally, it had other names. In France, they called it the inequality.
The crazy years.
The crazy years, exactly. Or in Germany, by the middle of the decade, they were calling it the Golden Twenties. It was a time of undeniable economic boom and cultural dynamism.
But, and this is a whole point of our deep dive, that prosperity, especially in the United States, was built on a profoundly fragile foundation.
Absolutely.
Oh.
The economy was growing like crazy, recovering fiercely from the post-World War I recession of 1919 to 21, and the acceleration of new technology was just breathtaking. It felt like a total break with tradition.
So our mission today is to unpack the evidence and really trace the lineage of the Great Depression. We want to show you exactly how the 2 core revolutions of the decade, the revolution in mass production and the revolution in mass credit, how they work together.
How they created this appearance of sustainable wealth while at the same time rigging the entire system for a catastrophic collapse.
The 1920s taught Americans to want things they didn't need and, crucially, to buy things they absolutely could not afford. And the inescapable truth we're going to keep coming back to is this. Prosperity built on debt is always prosperity borrowed from the future.
And eventually, the future comes to collect.
Okay, so to really get how revolutionary that dollar down idea was, we have to establish the baseline. What was the attitude toward debt before the 1920s?
It was shameful. Just full stop. Shameful. If you borrowed money for anything outside of, say, a heavily secured farm or a house mortgage, you were often seen as morally compromised, financially reckless.
So there was a real cultural stigma attached to it. The sources really emphasize this. A respectable person, a middle-class family, you saved. You paid in cash.
You paid in cash. If you couldn't afford that new sofa or a new winter coat, you waited. You did without. And the credit options that even existed were either predatory or really restrictive.
So what were those options? If you were desperate for money, where did you go?
Well, mortgages existed, but the barriers to entry were incredibly high. You typically needed a massive 50% down payment.
50%.
50%. And then you had to pay the whole thing off in like 5 to 7 years. So it was for the already well-off. Consumer credit, the kind we use for, a new phone or a TV today, it was basically non-existent for the general public.
So if you needed quick cash, you were kind of pushed to the margins of society.
Exactly. You had a few bleak options. Maybe you could get some limited credit from your local grocer, but that was based on your personal reputation. It was small scale.
Or you could go to a pawnbroker.
Right, and risk losing a family heirloom,
Okay.
something with real sentimental value. And then the very bottom tier, you had the loan shark. And there the interest rates were just astronomical. We're talking 100%, 200% annually. It was ruinous.
So the idea of borrowing money for a washing machine, a non-essential good, it was just,
Unthinkable.
yeah.
Absolutely unthinkable. And that's the world that the factory revolution just completely blew apart.
Right, because mass production was the technological engine that made all these new goods cheap enough that with a little financial nudge, they could finally reach the middle class.
And you saw industries like automotive, film, radio, chemicals. They just exploded. All of it supported by the U.S. economy successfully shifting from its wartime focus to this roaring peacetime consumer economy.
And when we talk about this revolution, we are, of course, talking about one name in particular, Henry Ford.
Henry Ford. He didn't invent the moving assembly line, to be clear, but he perfected it for complex, continuous manufacturing at his Highland Park plant, starting back in 1913.
And this wasn't just a small improvement. It was a genuine quantum leap in productivity.
The numbers are still just staggering even a century later. Before the moving line, a team of skilled workers took about 12 and a half hours to assemble a single Model T chassis.
Okay.
By breaking that work down into hundreds of tiny repetitive tasks, you put on this bolt, you tighten that screw as the chassis moves past you. Forward slash the production time to just 93 minutes.
From 12 and a half hours to 93 minutes.
It's an almost tenfold increase in productivity, just overnight. It's hard to even comprehend that kind of efficiency gain.
And of course, that speed translates directly into cost savings, which get passed on to the consumer.
Absolutely. The price of the Model T, which was the car of the decade, it just plummeted. It went from around $940 at the start of the 1920s all the way down to a mere $290 by 1929.
$290 for a car.
Ford had done it. He'd achieved his dream of making the car universally affordable, and the market just swallowed them up. By 1929, there were nearly 27 million motor vehicles registered in the U.S.
Let's put that number in context. What does that mean for the population?
It means about 1 in every 6 Americans owned a car. That was a far, far higher rate than any other industrialized nation on Earth. It cemented America's status as the richest country per capita in the world.
But the ripple effect is what's really important for the national economy, right? It's not just about the car itself.
Not at all. This explosion in car ownership was the catalyst for massive industrial growth in all these supporting sectors. It demanded enormous inputs of steel for the chassis, rubber for the tires, oil and gasoline for fuel,
Glass for the windows, energy to run the factories.
and then vast government spending on new infrastructure. You needed bridges, paved highways, and then this whole ecosystem of ancillary services sprung up. Motels, gas stations, dealerships that completely changed the face of the American landscape. The car remade America, physically.
Which brings us to Ford's other great innovation, one that had this profound social and economic impact, the $5 workday.
The $5 workday paradox, yeah. In 1914, Ford just shocked the entire industrial world by doubling the wages of his factory workers to $5 a day.
And everyone thought he was crazy as philanthropist.
They did, but it was pure, cold, calculated business logic. It was designed to solve a huge internal problem he was having.
And what was that problem?
Worker turnover. The assembly line work was mind-numbingly monotonous. It was physically demanding, spiritually draining. The sources say the work environment was so grueling that Ford's annual turnover rate was approaching 400%.
400%. So you're having to train 4 entire workforces every single year just to stay staffed.
Imagine the inefficiency, the cost. It was a massive drain. So doubling the wage to $5 a day, it instantly solved that problem. It gave workers a powerful incentive to stay, and productivity actually soared, justifying the extra cost almost immediately.
But the genius of it went even deeper, and it connects right back to our core thesis of mass consumption.
It's the key. Ford himself articulated this new economic model. Mass production requires mass consumption. By paying his workers a high wage, he instantly transformed them from mere laborers into loyal, eager consumers who could now afford to buy the very cars they were building.
He created his own market. The high wage became the down payment on this whole new consumer era.
Now, we do have to acknowledge the critical, darker side of this $5 workday, which the sources touch upon.
Right, there were strings attached.
Take strings. To get the full $5, workers had to submit to Ford's sociological department. This was basically an internal police force that actively monitored their home lives.
Monitored them for what?
To make sure they adhered to certain moral and, American standards. No drinking, no gambling. They had to maintain clean homes, ensure their family structure was stable. It was this idea that the high wage came at the cost of intense corporate surveillance and control over your personal life.
It's fascinating. Every economic boom seems to have that kind of hidden authoritarian streak. But for the economy as a whole, this mechanism, high production, high productivity, high wages, it propelled the entire U.S. forward.
It really did. It moved the country out of that immediate post-war slump and into this period of soaring growth. And you can see that confidence physically manifesting.
You mean the skyscrapers?
The skyscrapers. New York and Chicago competing to build ever taller buildings like the Empire State Building. They were these visible brass tack symbols of just intense national economic confidence.
And that confidence was completely underpinned by the political environment of the decade.
The Republican pro-business agenda. You had three conservative Republican presidents in a row, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, and all of them were staunchly promoting the interests of big business.
Coolidge's famous quote really sums up the whole philosophy perfectly.
The business of America is business.
Exactly. The government was utterly devoted to the principle of laissez-faire.
Which means, let it be. Let the market run free without government intervention. In practical terms, this meant almost zero regulation of the rapidly growing and increasingly speculative financial sectors.
So the banks and, most importantly, the stock market.
Right. This hands-off approach would become a massive structural flaw when all that confidence eventually evaporated.
They also use some pretty aggressive protectionism. This is a technical point, but we need to dwell on it because it really sets up the fragility we'll talk about later.
The Ford-Niemöller Tariff Act of 1922. This imposed massive tariffs. We're talking 400% on some goods on foreign imports.
And the stated goal was what? To protect American factories?
Exactly. To protect American factories and encourage people to buy domestic goods. But it had these immediate catastrophic repercussions internationally.
Because when the U.S. slams the door shut on foreign goods, other countries retaliate.
They have to. European nations, who were still recovering from the war and needed to export goods to pay back massive war debts to the United States, responded with their own high tariffs against American products.
And who did that hit the hardest in America?
American agriculture. The farmers. They had expanded massively during the war to feed Europe. Suddenly, their primary export markets for things like wheat, corn, cotton, they were closed off or just prohibitively expensive.
So this is a critical point. The farm depression didn't start in 1929.
Not at all. It began in the mid-1920s, and it was a direct result of the federal government's pro-business high tariff policy. It created a massive, struggling underclass in rural America.
And finally, what was happening with organized labor during this time of soaring profits?
Labor was being weakened significantly. The government and the courts allowed businesses to implement things like yellow dog contracts, which forbade workers from joining trade unions.
So even as profits were soaring, the ability of unions to organize or effectively lobby for higher wages relative to productivity gains just plummeted.
It did, and that contributed directly to the growing prosperity gap we'll get into. So you have the engine of mass production, soaring profits, and a political structure designed to protect business.
But you still haven't solved that original puzzle. The cultural hurdle of convincing average Americans to spend 3 months' salary on a new appliance right now, that requires another revolution.
A financial and psychological pivot.
And that pivot, the one that completes this cycle of mass consumption, is the introduction of mass credit. This is the true game changer of the 1920s.
And it wasn't driven by Ford, interestingly. He remained stubbornly committed to cash sales. He was driven by his greatest rival, General Motors.
Right. Ford had the market cornered on cheap, standardized transport, the Model T. You could have it in any color as long as it was black.
Exactly. But General Motors, under Alfred P. Sloan, they wanted to offer diversity, upgrades, status. A different car for every different income bracket.
But how do you sell a more expensive car to the masses?
You lend them the money. In 1919, General Motors founded the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, or GMAC. This was groundbreaking.
Why was it so groundbreaking?
It was the first time a major corporation created its own dedicated subsidiary just for consumer financing. It immediately normalized the concept of the installment plan.
So let's break down how this actually worked, because it's basically the engine of our modern economy.
It is. The customer would pay a small down payment, maybe 10 or 20%, and then they'd finance the rest of the purchase through GMA, paying it back in fixed monthly or weekly installments, usually over 12 or 18 months.
And the interest rates.
They were there, and often substantial, but the financing structure cleverly obscured the true cost of the loan. Consumers stopped looking at the total price of the car or the refrigerator.
They were just focused on that small weekly payment.
Entirely. How
Yeah.
much is it a week? Can I have that in my budget? That's all that mattered.
And the response from the public was just explosive.
A total market transformation. The sources show that by 1925, over 60% of new cars were being sold on credit. By the end of the decade, in 1929, that figure was pushing 75%.
3 out of every 4 cars.
Sold on credit. GMAZ proved the model worked, and it just spread like wildfire to every corner of retail.
Yeah.
Furniture, radios, appliances, everything.
And this financial contagion, as you call it, it quickly infected the whole consumer economy. What did that do to overall household debt?
It more than doubled. The total consumer debt held by American households shot up from $3.3 billion in 1920 to a staggering $7.6 billion in 1929.
So that psychological barrier against debt, the shame we talked about, it was just gone.
Utterly annihilated. Immediate gratification was now the new, achievable middle-class dream.
And what fueled this debt was this continuous stream of new, desirable goods to buy.
Largely thanks to the rapid electrification of the home. Electricity had been slow to penetrate U.S. households before the war, but in the 1920s, production almost quadrupled.
That's a huge jump in infrastructure.
It's a massive change. In 1912, only about 16% of U.S. households had electricity. By the mid-20s, it was almost two-thirds. And this cheap, reliable power didn't just light up homes. It powered the consumer goods boom.
This is where we see the creation of entirely new categories of what people considered necessities.
Exactly. The vacuum cleaner, the refrigerator, the electric washing machine, the electric iron. These things promise to eliminate the backbreaking manual labor of the past, especially for women.
And they instantly became symbols of modernity and status. You had to have them.
And you could get them everywhere thanks to a huge retail expansion. Catalog shopping was king. The Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog wasn't just a book. It was rightly called the consumer's Bible.
It brought the latest fashions and appliances to even the most remote rural towns.
And at the same time, you have the explosion of chain stores. JCPenney is a great example. They went from a few hundred stores in 1920 to an incredible 1,000 locations by the end of the decade.
So it democratized consumption. The installment plan and the newest gadgets were accessible everywhere, not just in New York or Chicago.
But credit and distribution, that's only two legs of the stool. You still have to generate the desire. You have to convince people they need that new radio today, even if they're already paying off 3 other installment plans.
And that's where the advertising machine comes in.
The modern advertising engine. Spending was just unprecedented. It soared from $1.4 billion in 1914 to over $3 billion by 1929.
And this wasn't just more ads, it was a whole new kind of advertising.
A qualitative revolution. Agencies like J. Walter Thompson, they pioneered scientific market research. They moved away from just listing a product's features. They started focusing on psychological appeals.
What we now call aspirational marketing.
Exactly. They weren't selling you soap. They were selling you the fear of body odor and social exclusion. They weren't selling you a car. They were selling you freedom and status. They sold an image.
The ads sold the dream, not the appliance. Dreams of country clubs, smooth skin, and social mobility. The sources talk about how this advertising leveraged the idea of keeping up with the Joneses.
It generated intense status anxiety. Your material possessions, the car you drove, the brand of cigarette you smoked like a Camel or a Lucky Strike, they became these instant, visible markers of your success and your modernity.
Consumption wasn't just an economic act anymore. It was a core cultural performance.
And the single biggest new medium that enabled this national advertising saturation was the radio.
Right. The first commercial station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, started broadcasting in 1920.
And within just 4 years, there were over 500 stations operating across America. This created, for the first time, a truly national, unified mass audience.
A revolution in intimacy, you could say.
It really was. The radio spoke directly to you right in your home, creating this immediate personal connection. And advertisers seized on this immediately by creating sponsored programming.
Like the Jell-O program or the Lucky Strike program?
Yeah, they integrated the product directly into the entertainment. They were subtly teaching millions of consumers about new goods and new ways to finance them, all wrapped up in a story or a song.
So this whole sophisticated nationwide machine convinced people that living beyond their means through debt wasn't just okay, it was necessary. It was how you participated in modern American life.
And the machine was incredibly successful. But it set the stage for these enormous structural weaknesses that were, just waiting to come home to roost.